Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 139 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Lynn Haraldson for this episode. And Lynn was widowed actually 40 years ago, and she was only 19 years old, and she had an 11-day-old baby at home. I really appreciated the longer lens that she brought to this experience of being a widowed parent. Her journey has had all sorts of twists and turns, to talk about trauma and grief and weight issues and mental health issues and anger, lots of things which she reflects on all of it in her new memoir, which is called Obesity of Grief. And I suggest listening, especially in our discussion here, for Lynn telling us about her daughter's high school project when she reached out to the newspaper in the small town that they used to live in to learn about the father that she had never known. Before we jump into my discussion with Lynn, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. First of all, I wonder if you saw the recent news from Judy's House, which is a grief support center in Denver, Colorado. And they do some really terrific grief support programs there. So if you are in or around Denver, check them out. They also do research for the benefit of the whole field of children's grief, looking at a number of things, but including especially trying to quantify just how big this issue is. And their newest numbers estimate that 1 in 12 kids will lose a parent or sibling by the time they turn 18 years old. And there isn't a breakdown between parent and sibling, I don't think, but it is mostly parent loss in that number, and then some sibling loss as well. So anyway, 1 in 12 kids will be grieving by the time they turn 18, and that's actually a jump up from it was previously 1 in 14. So the numbers are getting worse. As we all know, quite a few people have died in the pandemic, and quite a few of those people were the age when they had kids and teens at home. So this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. It's also, it varies a lot by state, actually. So Judy's House looks at nationwide numbers, and then they also look in every single one of the U.S. states to look at the different rates. And in this latest study here, the highest prevalence of grieving kids was in West Virginia, and the least number of grieving kids, I believe it was in Minnesota. And it looks like the rate was quite different, like twice as much, I think, in West Virginia. Anyway, if you're interested in looking at the numbers for your state, judyshouse.org, JUDIS house.org, you can get to, it's called the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model. So if you're interested in seeing that, have a look. I think the most important takeaway here from my perspective is that we're not alone. Those of us who are widowed parents, like with 1 in 12 kids losing a parent by the time they turn 18, that means there are far too many grieving kids, and those grieving kids have surviving parents, most of them, and those surviving parents are us, the widowed parents. So that's why I'm doing this work, and I wanted to share this with you guys just as a reminder that even if you don't know anybody in your personal circles who is widowed and has kids or teens, you really aren't alone. There are far too many of us, and it can really help to try to connect with some folks who are in a similar situation. Speaking of not being alone, that reminds me, actually, that the anthology that I've been working on, it's called Widowed Parents Unite, 52 Tips to Get Through the First Year from One Widowed Parent to Another. The whole message, I would say, is you're not alone, and here are 52 widowed parents who are a little further down this path, seasoned widowed parents who are reflecting and sharing something. The question that I posed to them was, what would you want to share with a new widowed parent? And write up a short tip and reflection in the kind of book that you can pick up and put down, read a little bit, put it back down. You don't have to get engrossed in a whole story. So I am working on this. Stay tuned for an announcement of when that will be available. But I wanted to let you guys know that is in the works, and I'm super excited about all the people who are contributing reflections to the book. I think you guys are going to love it. So that is all the news from here, and let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Lynn Haraldson. Lynn is a freelance writer, blogger, and former columnist who writes extensively about grief and body issues. She is the author of the new memoir, An Obesity of Grief, A Journey from Traumatic Loss to Undying Love. She's joining us today from Western Pennsylvania. Lynn, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you. I've been really looking forward to talking to you. I read your book. I enjoyed it very much. I think I said it was what did I say about here? You don't pull any punches on the resilience of grief and trauma in this fast-paced and insightful memoir.
Yes, that was a great line. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, and I was privileged to endorse it, and it's, as we record, it is out today, actually. So by the time listeners hear this, it'll just be out a short time. And we'll put a link, of course, in the show notes to your book. And so I'm very glad that you're here today to tell us all about it. You became a widowed parent quite a while ago.
Yes, I did. I'm now almost 60 years old, and I was 19 when my husband died, and our daughter was 11 days old. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and
that was back in the early 80s when...
Was it like 40 years ago, maybe?
It would be 40. It was 40 years ago this year.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Time flies, I guess.
Oh, lots happened in 40 years. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm looking forward to diving into that. Why don't we start in the beginning? If you could please tell us a little bit before everything changed, before your 11-day-old daughter and your husband dies. Like, what was normal? What was your normal life like before everything changed?
Yeah, we were, I was 18 when we got married. Bruce was 23. And, we lived in a small community called Jasper, Minnesota, in the southwest corner of the state. And 6 months after we were married, we moved to the family farm when his parents retired. And I was 4 months pregnant at that time. And we were farmers and raised cows. We raised pigs, had several acres, obviously, of corn, soybeans, that type of thing. Okay. And so we were farming and crazy happy in that really young way. We had our entire lives ahead of us, nothing bad could happen. Right.
Yeah.
And then Carlene was born, and that was exciting, of course. And also, neither one of us were like, oh my gosh, this is a new baby. What do we do? But we only had 11 days together, and Bruce died on March 22nd, 1983, when his tractor was struck by a freight train just a half mile from our farm. So
wow.
I heard, go ahead.
Oh, wait, the farm was in Minnesota, or you were from Minnesota originally? Or both?
No, we were all from Minnesota.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
I had met and married Bruce when I was living in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is just over the border.
Oh, okay.
And I had known Bruce in high school. He didn't really know me. He was just old enough than me. He didn't really know me, but I was in love with him when I was a kid.
He was the cool, older man.
Exactly. So we'd always lived there, and that's where it all happened, was on our farm in Southwest Minnesota. And
you said there was a train very close to your farm then, and there was a terrible accident.
Yes. He was coming home. I didn't know he'd left the property. The last thing he said to me was, I'll see you at lunch. I'm going to work out in the machine shed.
Okay.
So when I heard the train blowing like really long whistles, but we hear the train all the time. I mean, the prairie is very flat, sound carries. And I didn't think anything of it until my aunt called and said she'd heard there'd been an accident. And I said, well, Bruce is out in the machine shed. And then I found that, no, he had gone to town with two with some grain to bring it to the farmer's elevator. And so he was coming home from that, and he was going over it's a very washboardy dirt road, and he met the tractor, or the train right at the tracks, and
Wow.
he was killed. He was thrown from the tractor through the windshield.
Wow.
So,
He
yeah.
was driving a tractor, not a car.
No, he was in a tractor, and of course there's a cab on the tractor, and he was a big music head, so he probably had the radio cranked,
Sure.
because how else do you not hear a train,
Well, so that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's one of your, it seems like, central mysteries for many, many years. Like, how could he possibly have not heard this train coming that was whistle, whistle, whistle? You were hearing the whistle from the house.
Right. Yep. And I figured it out in the end. But that lived with me for a long time, because not just that question, but then of course, how could he have not heard? Why was he so irresponsible? What, why did he leave me? All of those questions too. And that fed some of my anger that I had denied for many years as well. So that's what all got peeled away in therapy, was the anger and all of that. And then my finding out the answer was so revolutionary to me. It was like, wow, that's okay. Now all those answers came together at the very end. So
maybe we can just fast forward to that point. Like, how did you eventually did answer that question for yourself, that, well, maybe he actually didn't hear it?
Yeah, I learned that he didn't hear it. That's kind of the end of the book. I can tell you what it is.
Oh, it's a spoiler. I guess you don't have to.
It's kind of a spoiler, but I did learn that. And what happened is it really relieved so many of those questions. And that's when that true healing could begin. Even though I'd done all kinds of good grief work in therapy, that moment is when I was like, oh, wow. And that's where the undying love comes in, because that's when I realized that, wow, I had been angry at the wrong thing all this time. And there was, he was still this loving, awesome husband that he'd been. He just made a horrible mistake, So that's why that journey, from the one end to the other end. It doesn't mean that I still don't think about it once in a while, and it does bother me, and I do cry. I miss him a lot, but having that answer was just wow. But getting to the answer took many years.
Well, yeah, that sounds like it was probably 3 decades in the making or something.
It was actually happened in 2007. So 24 years. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Years. Okay.
Yep. Well, took a while.
Yeah. And in your book, you go through all this time and all the various struggles and twists and turns and things in your life, I guess, since, from the time Bruce died and you were 19 years old to, I guess, today, or practically today. Let's back up to the beginning for a few minutes, though. So Bruce dies, and Carlene is 11 days old, and she's a very brand new baby, and you're just starting to get your feet wet as a parent and as a family. Yeah. What were those early days, months, years like? That whatever early period, the kind of first period for you?
Yeah, that because we lived on a working farm, I had to move 3 weeks after the funeral. So, the advice, don't move, within a year of loss or make big decisions. Well, and here I am 19 with, not a fully formed prefrontal cortex, making all these big, mature decisions. And so something had to give, and grief is what gave. It was like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm going to get back to normal, whatever that was. But what I really wanted was I wanted him back. I wanted that life back. I didn't want to go on like that. And sometimes it even felt like we never were. Like it never really happened. We were only together for 23 months. And then I'd look at our daughter who looks like so much like him. And I'm like, oh, well, but we were real, But when you move from a farm and then to a city, because we moved to a Minneapolis suburb to be near my parents, the life change was just so, not just over the top. It was like several times in a circle changed, it was, complete 180 many, many times. So, so that's what it felt like the first year. And I made a lot of mistakes that first year trying to be normal again. I looked for him in every guy that I met, and I tried not to think about Bruce, but to think about, my future. One thing, as far as, bad advice that people give you when someone dies, especially back in the 80s, was you're young, you'll get over it, you'll get remarried, and you'll have more babies. And which I did several times.
Did people actually say that to you, or was that kind of the subliminal messages from the culture, or both?
No, it was both. In fact, the day of the funeral, someone had asked me if I was going to get remarried.
What? Wait, and the day of the funeral?
Day of the funeral. And the day of the funeral, someone suggested to my sister-in-law that they adopt Carlene because I was only 19. Yeah, it was crazy.
And now you had no man to, I don't know, protect you or something, take care of you.
Sure.
So your sister-in-law may as well just take your baby?
Well, no, someone suggested it to my sister-in-law.
Right. Yeah.
So, and she's like, you'll never guess what someone just said.
Well, I'm glad she had the sense to, stop that.
It was so ridiculous. It's like, why would I hand over my baby ever? Right. She was wanted to be, just, oh goodness. But anyway.
Wow. Okay.
But I did get married a few more times, and that was, part of that unresolved grief as well. So gotcha. I did follow that advice kind of, and I had one more baby. But even she came into being because of unresolved grief just a year after Bruce died. I got pregnant with her a year after Bruce died. So, so yeah, that was the early days were pretty confusing as I tried to be normal again, and I didn't do it very well.
So, as I recall from reading the book, there was quite a bit of pain by the way the pastor and the mortician in the town handled the accident scene and your access to it and such. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was, I never saw Bruce dead. I never got to say goodbye. Even though it happened a half a mile from our home, I was not asked to identify the body. They had called his brother to do that. And they thought they were sheltering me from what was a horrific accident. But years later, our pastor, had written to us and had apologized for that they could have made it possible to at least touch part of his body and to say goodbye. But there's nothing we can do now. But what happened from that is I developed nightmares that I couldn't get to him, that he was alive, he'd survived. And he was, in a couple of them, he's in a nursing home and he's deaf or something or blind. And I can't get to him and he's asking for me. And these developed and I was having them with some frequency, several times a year. So it's like my brain hadn't processed that he died because my brain didn't see him dead.
Right.
So I'm a big advocate of saying goodbye in whatever capacity you can if that happens. So anyway, it took a long time for me to train my brain to not have those nightmares. I still dream about him, but I have a better way of controlling that. So
it's interesting. And obviously, as we meaning as a culture, learn more about grief, hopefully fewer things like that happen, but I'm sure it's things like that still. I think it's easy to see how, the pastor and the mortician were quote unquote well-meaning, right? They weren't trying to torture you. They did what they thought was best, but unwittingly, it sounds like set you up for more pain over the longer term than that immediate horror of having seen him.
Right. And what was so frustrating for me is that here, the person I love most in the world was dead, and I couldn't protect him. I couldn't protect him from speculation, from the eyes on him. It was that was really frustrating. I didn't like that at all. But I also didn't realize at 19 that I had a voice, that I was his wife. I was the one that got to say, no, you two can't tell me what I can and can't see. I have authority over this man's body.
Sure.
I was just told, remember him the way he was. The fact that they were traumatized by that scene, because our pastor was very close to Bruce and I. And in fact, the mortician left the profession shortly after Bruce's death. So I think they were blinded by their own trauma, and they didn't want me to experience that kind of trauma, but they didn't realize that they were putting another type of trauma on me.
Sure.
So when I did confront the pastor just a few weeks after Bruce died, well, the story was in the paper, and they published a photo of Bruce's body under a tarp, and his boots were sticking out. And I lost it, as you can imagine,
Yeah.
And I demanded to know, because I thought he had been struck by the train. His body had been struck by the train. I didn't realize that he had gone head first out of the window. So, and I say this in my book too. I mean, dead is dead. Why does that matter? But it mattered to me because there were his boots were sticking out. I saw that, and I had the pastor tell me what happened, and it was a brain injury. It wasn't, the rest of his body was intact, which made no sense to me that they wouldn't let me see him. So, but again, there was nothing we could do about it at that point. So
sure.
It was just, we all learned something from that. It was just sad that it had to be, I feel, at my expense,
Yeah, for sure. Well, and, if we can zoom out for a second here and say, I mean, I think part of the point of memoir, or part of the beauty of memoir as a genre, and this book is a memoir, is that hopefully other people can learn some things from our experiences and our reflections, right? If somebody else reads this and gets some better or additional or different understanding of maybe how to handle situations like this, it increases the depth of knowledge somehow. Maybe it'll help somebody else.
Oh, I hope so. I know that I was 19, and of course, being the early 80s, I had no access to people who may have had a similar loss. There weren't any books that I knew of. And of course, certainly I didn't know anybody, and nobody I knew anybody.
Sure.
And even to this day, I have met maybe one or two people who have experienced the death of a husband at an early age with a baby.
Right.
And even Carlene, I was talking to her the other day, and she's 40 years old now. And even this is
your first daughter with Bruce, right?
This is with Bruce. Yeah, this is Bruce's daughter. Even she hasn't met anybody in her 40 years who was raised by, whose parent died when they were a baby. So in writing this book, if someone else can pick this up and go, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one.
Right.
Because I still sometimes feel like I'm the only one. Yeah. That's really important to me too.
Yeah. As an aside, I don't know if you've ever gone to Camp Widow, but I know it's been 40 years since you were widowed, but you might enjoy it. You may find an awful lot of people who were widowed at various points.
That could be interesting. I might have to check that out, because I've always wanted to sit down and talk to people and say, oh yeah, did you have this happen? Or did you remember this and that? I once asked my dad, whose his father died when my dad was six years old. And I asked him, because my dad could remember so many things about his father. And when I think about me at 6, I don't remember a whole lot. Right. And he said that when he heard his father died, he memorized as much as he could in that short period of time, that just, I have to remember this. Okay. And that's what I did too. And because people have said, you wrote this book 40 years later, how could you possibly remember? Well, I keep journals. I kept a lot of journals. I've always been a journalist. And, but also I have a really good memory because I did that same thing. There are things that I can remember really well. And I'd love to sit down and talk to other widows and say, did you remember this part? Or what did you, because you don't forget certain things. You just don't, no matter how many years go by.
Right. And sometimes it's the most random things that get like seared into your brain.
Yes, it is. It is.
So, okay, let's switch gears a little bit. We've mentioned the word trauma a few times.
Yes.
And there was a part of your book that kind of jumped out at me here. And I think it was about maybe 20 years after Bruce died, in that range, you started seeing a new therapist for anxiety and panic attacks.
Right.
And she suggested that you had experienced trauma. And so this is some quoting from your book here. For more than half of my adult life, I've told the same pithy story. Quote, my husband died when I was 19. Pause. Quote, in a train wreck. Pause. Quote, and our baby was 11 days old. And then you say that last part is always the kicker. People respond with shock, followed by expressions of sympathy. I usually shrug and say, I got through it. I'm fine. And then you go on to say, when I tell this to my therapist, Amy, during our first session, she says, denial is one way in which I protect myself from the trauma of Bruce's death. And then you say trauma, not a word I've considered to describe my grief experience. That's something that soldiers have, not somebody whose husband died.
Right. Yep.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's a really interesting and important point.
Okay. Yeah, because that would have been in about 2007, 2006 when I started therapy for that that last time. Trauma, PTSD was not common. Well, I mean, it was common, but it wasn't talked about outside of the military. All right. And that's why I had that, wait a minute, how could it be post-traumatic stress? And how could it be trauma? I mean, he died. Yeah. But so I had to learn a lot about trauma. She helped me understand that his death, while all deaths carry a certain degree of trauma, the fact that he died in the way that he died, even talking about it now, I can feel my gut clench, because it was such a violent way to die. And that trauma, and hearing the words and hearing how he died and going through that, I stuffed a lot of that away because it was scary. It's scary to think about your husband dying in that manner. And, what were his last thoughts? Did he know all of that? So I didn't process any of that trauma. I just I went way deep with it. So that trauma came out in many ways later. One of my marriages, I was in a marriage with an abusive husband. And the trauma from that, I didn't call that trauma either. But then in therapy, she's like, yeah, you were afraid of the next traumatic incident. It's like, wow, I hadn't even thought about that. Mm-hmm. So I think that trauma is a better word now than to describe a lot of feelings that people have during those types of, aftermaths of those types of deaths, where it wasn't as accepted before, because again, you think, oh, that's a big word, and you don't, well, and first of all, you don't want to identify yourself as that, but then when you do, when she did it, it relieved so much. It was like, aha, that makes a lot of sense. And when I identified it as trauma and could see it as trauma, I could work through it, where it kind of unpacked itself.
Interesting. Right. Okay. So, you know what this is reminding me a little bit of? Because this was mind-blowing to me when I interviewed Megan Reardon Jarvis, and I don't know if you've come across her podcast. It's called Grief is My Side Hustle. She's a trauma therapist, a grief and trauma therapist. Mm-hmm. And I was asking some of the same questions as you, right? Like I can understand how, something like, for example, you're talking about PTSD from the military. I could also see how, maybe if you were a witness to a murder or something that could be traumatic, right? It felt to me like there were some types of deaths that might be inherently traumatic, and some types of deaths, like after an illness, that may be sad and terrible and awful. but I wouldn't have necessarily put the word trauma on it, right?
Right. Yep.
And what she explained, this was super interesting, is that the question of whether something like a particular loss traumatizes an individual has to do with that, whether it overwhelms that individual's ability to cope. And I'm thinking, because you mentioned before, you were 19, and I think you said something about the prefrontal cortex still developing, and, and you were young and in a position where, other people had authority or perceived authority and different things, and not having a lot of agency or whatever. And I'm wondering if some of that, like if some of the trauma was because it's such an overwhelming thing to happen at such a young age and in that way. And, and incredibly difficult to deal with. I don't know. It reminded me of the discussion with Megan. And I thought that was a really interesting point that she made.
Well, and I think too, that now understanding trauma that we do, I think if I had had access to that word to someone who had said, what you've experienced is traumatizing. And let's talk about that. I think if we had immediately identified it, or within a certain amount of time, had identified that earlier on, I could have grown up with that knowledge. Yeah. Because I was still growing up in many ways.
Yeah.
So I think that recognizing it as trauma almost immediately, instead of waiting 20 years, right. To hear that would be beneficial. It doesn't make that pain go away.
No.
But if we can face it and understand it as what it is, because so many times I thought it was my fault that I couldn't get over it. Like, you should be over it by now. Everyone said you should be over it by now. Everyone had a time frame. Even my mother-in-law had a time frame. Hers was 5 years, And when I wasn't there, I hadn't even thought. In your interview with Claire Bidwell-Smith, she had said she started experiencing panic attacks after her mother died, but she never associated those with her grief. And when I started having those too, I never thought of that as well. I thought it was because my father had had a heart attack and, Bruce had died, but that was just a sad thing. And when a psychiatrist had said, I think it's your grief that's causing, grief and anger is causing these things. And I went, no, I'm so over that. That was so 4 years ago. I know it's something else. It has to be something else. So again, it was, many years later that I finally was open to that, like the passage you read. Right. Amy had said to me, yeah, this is trauma and we're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that was hard. And it was harder, I think, at that point than it would have been earlier on. So
because you had another 20 some odd years of other things and
Yeah,
well, and it reminds me too, because I think you mentioned anger, I think a little bit. I think you eventually were able to explore the anger with Amy, with this therapist 20 plus years later, but that had come up earlier. I think you had a therapist you were calling Dr. Angry, who was suggesting that anger was, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I call him Dr. Angry because it's all he ever wanted to talk about. And grief,
This was early on sometime, right?
Yes. This was right. This was after I started having panic attacks, and I'd gone to all kinds of emergency rooms, seeking help. And finally, one physician had said, you need to see a psychiatrist. And I said, oh, you think this is all in my head? He said, no, but pills aren't the answer. You have to go see. And that's why I found this guy.
Okay.
And he's the one that suggested that grief and anger were part of why I was having panic attacks. And I was like, no. But he always wanted to talk about, could I have been angry at Bruce for dying? And I'm like, how dare you? He didn't mean to die. I am not angry. I am the keeper of his good name. He was a gregarious, wonderful person, right? How could I be angry at that? And so I blamed myself because I knew I was angry. I always blamed him, but I wasn't going to tell Dr. Angry.
Gotcha.
So, and he wanted to talk about my current marriage, which was to that abusive husband. And was I angry with him? Oh, no, because I didn't want to go into that. I didn't want to go into any of that anger with this doctor. And a lot of it had to do with, he was this grandfatherly, older kind of guy. He was also, he liked to talk a little too much about God. God loves you. God will save you. It's like, well, God hasn't been on my side too much right now,
Uh-huh.
So he was just not someone I could really talk to.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, it was many years before I was able to explore that. So anger was a big part of it. I was angry at him. I was very angry, but
Right.
just saying that made me feel so guilty,
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think these are confusing feelings that I think a lot of people feel, and they're not quite sure. Like you're saying, is it my fault? Am I it's like, am I the one who's wrong here somehow? Or
Right. Well, and also you feel like you're somehow saying something awful against the person you love so much, making them sound like, they did something wrong. And
sure.
Again, like I said earlier, I felt like I was his protector, but they wouldn't let me protect him, And so I felt like I still had to be that protector. Instead of making him a vulnerable human being, which he was, I put him on a pedestal. And how can you be angry at your gods? So that took a long time for me to met out and deal with.
Right. Yeah. I just was thinking here, and this is completely like zooming out again, but what a treat it is to talk to somebody who's been dealing with this for so long. Like you have a long period of time to reflect on, right? Like I usually talk to people who are closer to their loss, and they have lots of valuable things to share, and different valuable things to share. Sometimes there's practical stuff, or I don't know, whatever, right? And also bringing in this perspective of someone, you're like, okay, this happened 40 years ago, and there's been a lot of twists and turns and lots of time for reflection, right? And adding that longer lens on this, I think is really valuable. So I guess just thank you.
Well, thank you. I've heard from a lot of people, because I've been writing about grief for many years. And I hear from a lot of people who will say, my daughter died when she was 2, and now I'm, 65, and I still miss her, and I'm grieving her, and I didn't think that was okay. I think the advantage now is we have like you said, so much more research on grief. There are so many more outlets for grief. The internet has been a blessing for that. I wish your book, I wish the internet, I wish everything had been there in 1983,
Yeah.
But so I think a lot of people in my age group, maybe even Gen X baby boomers who had grief, experienced traumatic grief years before, but had no outlet for it, and just went on living their lives. And then they wake up, one morning, and they're crying, and they can't remember, why am I crying? I'm so over that. Why is this, And I think we do need to dive back into past trauma like that to really uncover why people are experiencing some of the depression that they're experiencing now. I think there's always something in the past that we can look at, and usually it's uncovering some kind of grief, especially for older people.
I do want to make sure we talk about another, I think, really important aspect of your story, and you go through this in the book, which I think is, well, let me just jump into the question. Your daughter, Carlene, was 11 days old.
Yeah.
So she really didn't have any opportunity to have any memories of her father or know him firsthand.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that played out? And including, especially, I'm interested in when she was in high school, she did a project, which I'd love for you to tell us about.
Okay. Yeah. Carlene always knew that Bruce was her father. She always knew that. She was very close with his parents. They adored her, as you can imagine. That she was very, very important to them. And I made sure that they saw her all the time too. She would go down for weekends, except for a little bit of time when she's like when she's around 5 or 6, she started getting that homesickness, that time. But then she got over that, and then she'd go back down, and unless she was with me, right? And she would go out there every year. We moved out to Pennsylvania, And I made sure she got out there, and she loved being out there. But she didn't really know her dad very well. They didn't talk much about him, and she wasn't close to his siblings, and they never talked about it to her. So for graduation, one of the requirements for her graduation in her school was seniors had to present a project that demonstrated their accumulated knowledge.
And this was high school graduation.
This was in high school. Yeah, okay. High school graduation. So this is around 1999, 2000. And some kids were, writing plays or songs or performing volunteer service or volunteer work. And Carlene decided to write a biography about her dad. Ah. And so I helped her write letters to the editors of the papers that were around the Jasper area, asking for their memories of Bruce. And I warned her, I said, don't expect a lot of feedback, because it was 17 years at that time. I said, people may not even read these letters, and, not a lot of people stick around those areas. They move away, and.
And this was a small town of about what size we're talking about?
Oh, 600 people.
Oh, okay. A very small town.
The whole county, Pipestone County, has about 11,000 people.
Okay.
So it's a very rural community.
Gotcha.
And so, I didn't have a lot of hope for it. I'm like, oh, she might get a couple letters, people who recognize our name and everything. Because I still had relatives there. My grandmothers were still, my grandmothers had passed, but everyone knew us. Knew of us. Mm-hmm. And, but within a week, she had her first package, and it was from Bruce's second grade teacher. Oh. And it had she had made a copy of a get well card that Bruce had sent her in his little second grade handwriting, and then she attached his picture from second grade. And it was really sweet, Nice. I thought, oh, that's really great. But then within 2 to 3 weeks, she had 40, 50, responses correspondent.
Wow.
I mean, people sent her sheet music. I said Bruce was a incredible singer. He sang at a lot of weddings and things. And so they'd sent her sheet music. They'd sent her ticket stubs, memories. The stories were just amazing, right? But the one that she got that was most important was from our former high school choir director. His name was Bob Jones. He had directed Bruce in 2 musicals. In which he was the lead, in Little Abner and Oklahoma. And Oklahoma being, one of his performances of Oklahoma is when little 8th grade me fell in love with him. He didn't know who I was, but I was like, Google it. I said I became his groupie. He just didn't realize it. He noticed me 4 years later at a Styx concert. And that's how we got together.
Okay. Gotcha. And I just have to interject and say, now I have Oklahoma stuck in my head. But okay, keep going with the story.
There will be another song that'll get in your head too.
Okay, all right.
So Bob sent along a cassette tape of practice from Oklahoma. And I hadn't heard Bruce's voice since the day he left, the day he walked out the door saying, goodbye, I love you, I'll see you at lunchtime. And so I was pretty nervous, and I felt that grief gut, happening, like, oh my God, I've been trying to tamp this down for so long. And I worried, would I even recognize his voice? His singing voice. And I considered asking Carlene to listen to it by herself. And, but then I thought, I'd witnessed all her milestones. I did. He couldn't, right? So, her first words, her first steps, her first tooth, all of that. I couldn't miss hearing the first time she heard her father's voice. So I agreed to play it, and we listened to Surrey with the Fringe on Top in our living room. And and while it hurt, it was probably the best I'd felt since he died. To hear his voice like that was just amazing. That's why I'm such an advocate of people taking pictures and videos and everything. Because I took when my granddaughter was born, I took a lot of videos, and my mom's like, why are you taking so many videos? I'm like, because I never had any of Bruce. I'm big on that. So take videos, right? So anyway. So that was a lot of fun. And she was, like she said, I finally have the whole package. She said, I finally know what he sounds like. She knows what he looks like. She knew he was her dad, but she'd never heard him. Now, our next, I'm sure someone out there has a video of him singing in their wedding, and I'd like to find that, but so far I haven't.
Okay. If anybody's listening and knows of anybody who, tracing back to your small town, reach out.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sending out an invitation, and you got it. I'll pay for the, whatever it takes. Because that would be kind of fun too.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So she said she finally had the full pack. So this was, now she was like, what, 17, 18 years old?
Yep. She was 17. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And, but before she could finish writing her, she had to write a presentation and deliver a presentation. One of her best friends died in a car wreck. Oh. And that sent her, she could relate to the grief that everyone had been writing to her about her father. Here she was smack dab in the middle of it herself, and which put a different perspective on her project in general too.
Yeah.
And so here's this girl who'd grown up in the shadow of my grief that I never shared with her, and now she's going through her grief, and I wish I'd done a better job of preparing her somehow, So there was all of that. That was just a really, obviously an unexpected and horrible turn of events.
Sure.
So, yeah.
So I think this is, thank you for sharing this with us. And I think there's some interesting, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, but I mean, the example you're setting of the importance, eventually, because one might say, people might say, oh, she was so young, it doesn't matter, she never knew her father, so she won't miss him, like some of those kind of things.
And we did get a lot of, there was some of that, because she even said, I can't miss what I never had, but sometime during that project, that changed. She said, I wish I'd had that father. I wish I knew that person. And I do too. And it breaks my heart still that she didn't get to know that person.
Yeah.
Especially since she's so much like him in many ways. But like I was saying that, if it's too painful to talk about that child's parent, the other parent who died, children are watching you, they learn from us. And so if we're avoiding our grief and other difficult feelings, we risk passing that on to them. And then if something does happen to them, like her friend's death, she was, not that you can prepare yourself for death and grief. That's something that's difficult to do. But I think she would have felt better knowing that I understood better than maybe I had let on, So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I thought that was maybe from the perspective of my listener. Well, all of your story, I think is useful. Or, what's the word I'm looking for? Poignant. I don't know where I'm going with this. I need another cup of coffee. But what I'm saying is this particular part I thought was especially poignant as an example for my listeners of like figuring out some way to help your kid or kids, no matter what age they were when their parent died, very young kid, grade school age, teenager age, come to know their deceased parent better and have some kind of lasting connection. I think you've illustrated the importance of this and one way of doing it.
Yeah. And I also want to put the onus on the family of the deceased parent too. Because no one can tell a story like the parents and siblings of someone who's died. They know that person in a way that a spouse can't. Unless they grew up from day one together, which is very rare. So I really would advise people who maybe their brother passed away or their cousin passed away and they were a parent to share those stories all the time. They don't, not just, one time and done, but maybe at Christmas time, send a card with a little story or on their birthday, whether it's the deceased parent's birthday or the child's birthday. Kids want to know where they came from and they need to hear those stories. I only knew Bruce intimately for 23 months. He had friends who knew him from day one, and his family knew him from day one. But she still doesn't hear anything from his family. So she's still close. She's close to a couple of cousins, but she's not heard those stories. And I really wish she could hear some of those, because I think she'd learn even more. I mean, even at 40 years old, she could learn more about where she came from.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think that's a really, I think, instructive point for the families, the friends, the people around that person who died to help share. Sometimes even people always wonder what to write in condolence cards, right? Writing condolence cards is awful, and you can write, "I'm sorry for your loss." But you also, if you have a story to share, you could share some kind of memory, story. I remember how kind your dad was, and an example or something like that, which, the surviving parent then could save those, and they could become a tool, down the road for helping the kids come to know their parent better. Yes, absolutely.
We can't be afraid to say their names. We can't be afraid to bring them up, because, as you know, I mean, we want those, our loved ones to be remembered. We want to remember them. And it can be hard, and it can be hurt and painful at first,
right.
Or even many years later. We're having there's a reunion going on in a school reunion going on in Jasper in July, and I may attend, and I'm going to hear stories about Bruce. And it's not going to be like, "Oh, that's great." It's going to be, "Oh, that's sad because he's not here to share it too."
Right.
But I want to know. I want to hear them. Right. So it doesn't really matter how much time goes by. You still want to keep those memories alive, even though some people still want to stuff those things down. "Oh, I better not say his name because it'll upset them." Well, let us be upset. Let us cry. It's okay. Don't be afraid of that.
I hope you're bringing copies of your book along with you.
I do. I've sold quite a few to people down there, so that should be interesting. Good. So it's kind of what will they think? Because they know the whole situation much better than other people would read it. So I hope I got the details right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Gosh, this is so great. The one thing we haven't explored, actually. Tell me about the title of your book. The title, again, is An Obesity of Grief, A Journey from Traumatic Loss to Undying Love. The first part, the main title, An Obesity of Grief. Tell us about that.
That is from the poet Ellen Bass. And she writes a lot of poetry. I think she's one of my favorite. Hold on just a moment. I'm sorry. I'm going to screw up the title if I don't get it right.
No problem.
She wrote a poem called "The Thing Is," and she writes it's about grief and love. To love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it. And she goes on about, the grief sits with you. It's tropical heat thickening the air, and then she says it weighs you down. Grief weighs you down like your own flesh, only more of it. An obesity of grief, and you think, how can a body withstand this? And I just was blown away by that poem when I read it many, many years ago. And when I was writing this book, I read that poem several times just to kind of, And I went, but that An Obesity of Grief really stuck out to me, because part of my journey in life has been with weight and body issues too. And when I was at the hardest time of grieving is when I tried to take control of something, and I decided to take control of my weight. And the first time I did that was shortly before my ex-husband and I got divorced, the abusive one, when the doctor said, "Oh, it's your anger, it's this and that." I'm like, "No, it's not. It's I just need to lose some weight and I'll be fine." And I ended up losing 100 pounds. And then after Carlene's project, and I was just not dealing with it very well, my doctor put me on an antidepressant, and within 4 years, I'd gained a lot of weight. And again, I hadn't dealt with the grief, but I wanted to go off the antidepressant, and I wanted to deal with grief. It was time. And to do that, I also lost a lot of weight again, too. So grief and weight for me went hand in hand. Grief and body issues went hand in hand. Of course, these were before I met Bruce. I mean, I always had body issues, and he loved me no matter what I looked like, whatever, but I never heard that, so body issues continued to plague me for many, many years. And so that's why the book title of An Obesity of Grief is kind of has a dual meaning.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's so much to talk about here. I think we've covered so many good things.
We have. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I really appreciate your sharing all this with us. I think that we probably better wrap up with one last final question. I always like to ask my listeners, so I'll ask you the same. Mm-hmm. If you could say one thing to newly widowed parents, what would it be?
That would be to don't be afraid to talk about that their parent, and if you are having a problem talking about it, get into therapy, to find someone to talk to, because your children will watch you and learn from you, and they need to be able to tell you what they're feeling as well. Even though Carlene was only 11 days old, as she grew up, I wish I'd given her the opportunity to talk more about it with me, or and encourage your children to write about it if they can't talk about it. So that's my advice. That's something I wish I had known back in the day.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Lynn Haraldson, author of the new memoir, An Obesity of Grief, A Journey from Traumatic Loss to Undying Love. So Lynn, where can listeners find you if they'd like to learn more about your work?
My website is my name.com, lynnharaldson.com. And you can find me on Facebook too, if you want to click on those links as well.
All right. Well, we will put a link to your website in the show notes, as well as a link to your book, which I think is available now everywhere books are sold. Yep. So make sure we put that in the show notes as well. All right. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Well, thank you for the great conversation.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Lynn Haraldson as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 139. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.